Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining the Equilibrium Institute's discussion today. This discussion will be about the Taiwan Miracle and its economic lessons for Hungary. I think it's no doubt that the first half of the 20th century was an economic disaster for Hungary. In the 20th century, the country lost two world wars. We lost 2/3 of its territory, the majority of our territory. We were under Soviet occupation. So this disaster happened, but even in these sad circumstances, an average Hungarian lived twice better than an average Taiwanese in the 1950s. At that time, in the 1950s, Hungary's GDP per capita was around 2,500 USD. At the same time, the Taiwanese GDP per capita was around 900 USD. Taiwan at that time was a little bit richer than Côte d'Ivoire or Pakistan, but it was definitely poorer than, for example, Ghana or Kenya. 70 years later, Taiwan is one of the richest countries on earth. Its GDP per capita is more than 70% now than the GDP per capita of Hungary. So we at the Equilibrium Institute is devoted to give and draft policy proposals and recommendations to decision makers to make Hungary richer, to improve the country's economy, to make it more competitive. And that's exactly why we believe the Taiwanese example is important for us. First, because it shows that even a relatively poor country can become one of the richest in the world, even in a few decades. It is also that we should note that this is not easy, it is not frequent, but it is possible to avoid the middle income trap. We believe that there is no determinism in this regard. Secondly, we believe that the Taiwanese example is important because it shows that the country can become rich even if it lacks any natural resources such as gas or oil. And also a country can become rich if she feels isolated, well, just as Hungary sometimes feels. So for that reason, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion on the Taiwanese miracle and its lessons for Hungary. And it is a great privilege that we will have here today His Excellency Mr. Liu Shih-Chung, the head of Taiwan Representative Office. And we also have great panelists, such as Mr. Jieh-min Liu and Jieh-min from Taiwan. We also have for this discussion, Mr. László Urbán, an economist who is also a member of the Equilibrium Institute Advisory Board. And today's discussion will be moderated by Ms. Edith Inotai. She is a senior fellow at CID. So right now I give the floor to Edith Inotai to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamás. We are going to have two presentations and then the discussion, and we would also be very happy to take questions from the audience. For that purpose, please use the chat function on your screen. Well, as Tamás already mentioned, Taiwan and the so-called Asian tigers can boast of a sensational economic performance in the last 4 or 5 decades. Data from the International Monetary Fund reveals that economic growth in Taiwan skyrocketed during the last 4 decades, starting at around $10,000 per capita on purchasing parity power in 1990 and reaching almost $60,000 per capita on purchasing parity power today, which means a 6-fold growth compared to the base of 1990. If we look at the Hungarian data, economic growth is also undeniable, but at a much lower rate, reaching around $35,000 per capita in 2021. And there is a certain fear that Hungary will be caught in the middle of the so-called middle income trap. Their salaries are no longer competitive for a manufacturing country, but innovation and technological capabilities are still too low to compete in the league of the advanced or high-income countries. The Taiwan Miracle is not only about fast growth, but also about having or creating companies which have become global leaders in sectors like innovation, like TSMC, which is the world's largest semiconductor company. The question for us today is to discuss what a country like Hungary can learn from the Taiwan experience. What are the elements, what are the measures, the business and government practices which led to this Taiwan Miracle, and whether they can be implemented in Central Europe. Let me first ask Mr. Professor Shih-Chung Liu to tell us a bit about the key elements of the Taiwan Miracle. How did it all begin, and what was the role of the government?
Thank you very much, Edith, for giving me the floor. And thank you also again for the invitation from the Equilibrium Institute and the Taipei Representative Office in Hungary. It's my great pleasure to share with you some of the observations and research works that we have been undertaking on Taiwan's economic reform. In the first instance, when I received the invitation to share the so-called Taiwan Miracle topic for us, because many here in Taiwan believe that we are also in a kind of trap of income growth, right? It's a continuous debate here also in Taiwan, whether we have been trapped in the slowness of economic and wage growth. That said, I'm still happy to share with you some of the Taiwanese experiences on how we get here today and what's the challenges ahead, and most importantly, what will be the lessons, positive and negative lessons that we can share with our colleagues in Hungary. Let me start sharing to facilitate my presentation. I'll be sharing some of the numbers because diagrams will be easy to get noted in the process. Okay, so is that working? Can you see the slides now? Okay, thanks. Now, just to save time, I'll be using a simple framework for assessing the success solutions to avoid or to escape from the so-called middle income trap. I'm using this three-pillar or three-dimension assessment as the framework for my subsequent presentation. According to this paper presented back in 2015 on the UNCTAD report, the three major pillars for any country to avoid or to escape from the middle income trap is, first of all, to get the education right, and second, change export composition accordingly, and also the last one is industrial upgrading through state intervention. And I'll try to share with you Taiwan's experiences in reflecting or addressing these three objectives. Now, first, let me start with the general feature, the main features of Taiwan's economic structure. As the topic of this slide says, I believe that Taiwan's economic structure is the very essence of Taiwan's economic structure is a deep integration with the global supply network. To demonstrate this, let's take a look at the change of composition of Taiwan's export products category between 1989 to the year 2015. In 1989, about 25-30 years ago, about 40% of Taiwan's exports are consumption goods. That is final products that's being produced to be used by end users, final consumers, right? So at that time, you will see a lot of made in Taiwan products. So we were joking at that time, Taiwan was visible outside product. And in the year 1989, parts and components, as well as processed goods, accounts for roughly 30% of Taiwan's export. But let's look at the composition all the way fast forward to the year 2015. By the year 2015, the ratio of consumption goods of Taiwan's export has reduced from 40% all the way to less than 10%. It has remained at this level somewhere between 8 to 9% from the year 2014 onwards until today. Right? So that means Taiwan has been moving away from assembling final products and moving into the area of producing parts and components plus processed products. That's a strong indication of Taiwan being a major supplier of the global supply chain. But the role of Taiwan is being moved from assembling plants to the production of critical parts and components. So parts and components plus processed goods accounts for around 70 to 80% of Taiwan's export today. Right, so that's the basic characteristic of Taiwan's economy. And there were several stages for Taiwan's government to introduce different policy to upgrade the economic structure. You know, in the last, starting 70 years ago, let's start in the 1960s. The main target of the 1960s is actually to attract foreign investment through, for example, the establishment of the export processing zone, right? We formally closed our last export processing zone in January this year. So EZ zone is not in Taiwan anymore. So they've been around for over 60 years. All this export processing zone is targeting foreign investment that are looking for offshoring assembly locations. So we started with assembling, creating assembling plants by attracting relocated foreign investments. By the 1970s, the main focus of policy on the policy side is the refinement of physical infrastructure and also the promotion of export. Another turning point is in the 1980s to 1990s. In the late 1980s, we start to see a migration of Taiwanese assembling facilities to China mainland. So China become well, you know, what happened in 1989 is that there's a Tiananmen Square massacre, and most of Western countries start to blockade China. So Taiwan and China at that time is trying to attract foreign investment from other parts of Asia Pacific countries, including, of course, Taiwan. And also Taiwan's application to join the WTO, the process starts in 1992. So in the process of negotiation, we underwent a very dramatic structural reform of our economic governance and other areas. Let me quickly to share with you what happened in the last 10 years. Now you can see in terms of changing composition of our manufacturing sector as well as export, in the last 15 to 20 years, semiconductor plus electrical machinery and equipment has dominated Taiwan's export. You know, let's take the year 2017 as the example. Electrical machinery and equipment accounts for about 45% of Taiwan's export, and semiconductor accounts for around 30%. So let's put in this, over 70% of Taiwan's export are focused on semiconductor and electrical machinery and equipment. And semiconductor is, of course, in the last 18 months become the focus of attention in many different parts of the world. TSMC, of course, is the world leader of semiconductor contract manufacturer, plus UMC and other smaller foundries. We account for over half of the global chip production, especially in the logical chip area. In the latest US report on critical supply chain review, it indicates that over 90% of the logical chips demand in the US was supplied by Taiwan, primarily by TSMC. So this is a very unique and specialization process that took place in the last 10 years. China remained to be a manufacturing hinterland. As you can see, in last year, in the year 2020, the top 10 exporting company in China, in the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, 6 of these top 10 companies are Taiwanese investments. You can, as here by the indicated by the T. So you see the supply chain network relationship remain very strong. But another feature is that the trade between Taiwan and China is dominated by semiconductors. 49% of our export to China are semiconductors. So people are asking whether we have do we have a fear of over dependency on China? I would say that at this moment we are not seeing a danger, because it's actually a reverse dependency. It's actually China who is depending on Taiwan for the supply of semiconductors. But in terms of adaptability, we are actually moving away from China. You can see back in the year 2010, over 80% of Taiwan's outbound FDI goes to China. But by the year 2019, or let's say 2018, maybe that is a better example, our share of outbound FDI to China has reduced to less than 40%, and most of the outbound FDI goes to somewhere else, most likely Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and other parts of the world. In India also become a new destination. So it's a reflection of Taiwan's adaptivity because of the supply chain reform that has been ongoing for the last 5 to 6 years. Now, finally, some words on government intervention. On industrial upgrading through research and development, you can see the R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP for countries, selected countries that are reflected in this chart. Taiwan's R&D expenditure is always constantly around 3 to 3.5% in the last 5 years. Whereas in Hungary, the R&D expenditure is around 1 or 1.5%. Right. So this, you can see most of the countries who will identify as being able to escape the middle income trap are countries who are devoting resources into R&D expenditure. Right. Taiwan is one example. Israel is another good example. Japan, Korea, and of course the People's Republic of China. But for R&D resources, the key here, the key experience we learned from the Taiwanese side is actually we have to encourage more private sector participation. As you can see, about 80% of Taiwan's R&D expenditure comes from the business side, the private business. Government only is providing less than 20% of the R&D expenditures, right? So how policies designed to encourage more private sector participation should be the priority if we want to have a sustainable investment in research and development activities. By the same principle, it applies to Germany, Japan, Korea. But in the case of Hungary, about 50% of the investment comes from the private sector. And governments still play a very important, relatively important role in finding and directing resources into R&D areas. Finally, education matters. So this is a distribution of first university degree awarded to Taiwanese students in science and engineering. As you can see, science and engineering, the dark blue denotes engineering degree, computer science, agriculture, physical biology science. They are still the dominating subject matter that young Taiwanese people choose for their first university degree. And that underpins industrial transformation and also underpins R&D, sustainable R&D development. So finally, a few takeaways. First, Taiwan's secrets remains in our deep participation in the global supply network. Even though the content of our supply is changing over time, but that remains Taiwan's most important growth model, right? TSMC is still contract manufacturing, but now we are not contract manufacturing toys, rather we are contract manufacturing semiconductors. But the core business model remain basically the same. Secondly, let the private sector to take the lead. So we should encourage more private sector participation in the process of upgrading. And third one is all decisions come with costs and risks. For example, our decision back in the 90s to start large scale migration to China is producing negative consequences or social and economic consequences on Taiwan. So we should be conscious and constantly alert about the risks and costs. And finally, education really matters. I think Taiwan's success really is underpinned by our inputs and efforts on education reform, despite the fact there are still a lot of loopholes and things that need to be refined. But I think education is one of the ingredients for Taiwan's success. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Li. That was already very, very enlightening. I will have a lot of questions later on. I'm sure Mr. Urbán will also join the discussion about what could be taken over from Taiwan and Hungary. But let's just turn to Mr. Jieh-min. I am aware that you also prepared a short PowerPoint presentation to highlight the most important characteristics. Could you please lead us through the slides? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Edith. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to present on this conference. We know that Taiwan's success story of economic growth can be quite complicated, but to cut it short, in what follows, I will focus on a few points. First of all, for Taiwan, economic development and the national survival cannot be taken separately. Since the end of the World War II, Taiwan's sovereignty status has been contested. So any change in geopolitics is always sensitive to Taiwan. And the Taiwanese have been keen to face it and make good use of it. Taiwan has been undergoing sustainable growth since economic takeoff in the 1960s. There were only 2 years of negative growth over the last 3 decades, with an average of 4.6% growth rate for the entire period. Quite outstanding performance for a country past the takeoff period. As you can see from the figure, Taiwan has avoided the middle income trap, so to speak, during the 2000s, and the economy keeps on thriving. The Taiwanese enterprises are good at catching up along the global supply chains. They quickly respond to international buyers' demands and engage in flexible and network production. Taiwan was noted for its prowess in traditional industries, and since the 1980s, the ICT industries have become a leading sector. And more recently, semiconductors are becoming a star industry. Taiwan is crucial in the global semiconductor supply chains, with TSMC the leading firm, the leading IC chip foundry. But we shouldn't forget about the small and medium-sized enterprises, which paved the foundation for Taiwan's economic takeoff. Today, they are still a pillar for the export economy. The small and medium-sized enterprises have cultivated enormous manufacturing skills and accumulated a large amount of capital. In addition, Taiwan's education systems have created a high-quality workforce, and our country's STEM education is excellent. What about the government's role? Taiwan is a typical developmental state in a textbook. True that industrial policies steered by the state are critical, but it's not always that successful. Some positive while the others are negative or simply wasting public resources. However, the government still have something to boast of. Semiconductors come to our mind immediately. Not less importantly, the tax burden for corporations in our country is remarkably low, and the government provides population with relatively equitable and low-cost education and public goods, such as the world-renowned universal health insurance program. And this program's coverage includes migrant workers. Please, next slide. Taiwan's capital and the business people have been going in and out of China over the past 3 decades. They rushed westward, just following the dictation of the global supply chains, namely the international buyers. Taiwanese enterprises brought in the capital, the skills, and Western markets into China, helping China to achieve an export processing trade model. The Taiwanese made a lot of money, of course, there, and the Chinese got much in return, especially the government and the Chinese emerging manufacturing sector. As shown in this figure, the mainland fever reached the peak in the year 2010, and then Taiwanese began to diversify. To diversify, I want to stress that point, to diversify its investment destinations, again, following the shift of global value chains. The new destinations include ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam, the United States, India, the EU, and so on. On top of that, in recent years, many ICT corporations came back to Taiwan to invest, and the government managed to provide tax incentives and the land and the utilities supply to them. Next slide, please. The cross-strait economic ties are essentially investment-driven. Taiwan's trade relations with China began to boom in the 1990s, and it reached a peak in 2010. Primarily, the trade pattern is the outcome of the triangular trade. A majority of Taiwanese invested factories utilize the cheap Chinese production factors and they export their products rather than depending on their, Chinese end markets. By comparison, German Volkswagen and South Korean Hyundai, for instance, rely heavily on the Chinese market. So this is a key point we need to bear in mind when we interpret the figures and make comparisons. Since the US embarked on the trade war and the technology war on China, there have been increased in exports of semiconductors and electronics from Taiwan to China due to the changing geopolitical tension and the restructuring of traditional trade patterns. Next slide, please. Thank you. There are some structural features in Hungarian economy similar to the Taiwanese. Hungarian economy is highly dependent on Germany in terms of trade. And China is an emerging major trade partner for Hungary. Hungary is one of the most influenced in Europe by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So we may surmise that the economic and the political stake with China in this country has created a constituency in the local Hungarian politics. In terms of international political economy, the China-German-Hungary nexus is fascinating. Let's just take a look at Volkswagen and analyze its supply chain structure and its market share in China, and then we can better understand this global nexus, this quite complicated interdependence between German, China, and Hungary and other, Visegrad countries. Both figures on this page compare Hungary and Taiwan in GDP per capita and the degrees of trade independence, we found that Hungary seems to get caught in the so-called middle income trap since the global financial crisis. But the value of Hungarian currency is undervalued to boost exports in this period. So if measured with PPP, purchasing power parity, the picture should become a little more rosy for your country. As you can see from the figure on the right, Hungary is even more heavily dependent on foreign trade than Taiwan. That's amazing. This may explain why some Hungarians place high hopes on the frozen EU-China comprehensive agreement on investments, shorthanded as CAI. People have fears of losing the Chinese market. And again, the China-German-Hungary nexus is a reminder in point. Next slide, please. Thank you. As I illustrated above, Taiwan and China relations are complicated. To make it short here, I just point out that both countries are in a relationship of what I call the rival partners. The economics and the politics are entangled with each other. By dealing with China-Taiwanese companies used to enjoy many opportunities, but now the risks are emergent and costly. We are now sailing into deep water, full of intensified competition, and we know that China engaged in economic espionage toward Taiwan and the entire world. Beijing also leverages the economy for political goals. In sum, Taiwan contributed to China's economic rise, which in turn produced a perverse effect upon itself. This is what the American international relations scholar John Mearsheimer once said. He said this about 7 years ago. He told us Taiwan has been creating its own nightmare by helping Chinese economic rise. Okay, next one. To conclude, Taiwan's experience can offer us a few takeaways. First of all, there are several key terms in its success stories. We can name human capital, flexible production network, the resilience of small and medium-sized enterprises, and a strong position in the global semiconductor supply chain. Number two, Taiwan and Hungary as well, as a medium-sized advanced economy, we should always avoid getting trapped in the low labor cost competition, race to the bottom, so to speak, or avoid get caught in the wage stagnation. And we should always follow the global value chains and try to upgrade and climb along the chains. And number four, Hungary and the EU should be aware of the China nexus. That is the Hungary, China, Germany nexus, which may inflict two risks. First, the first one is the chain effect of China's economic slowdown. We know that China used to enjoy a two-digit growth numbers for almost 20 years, but its economy has been going down over the last 7 years or so. Germany is highly dependent on China's market, as you know, and Hungary is dependent on Germany and China now. The slowdown of the Chinese economy due to its declining purchasing power may bring enormous risk to your country and to Germany, among other EU countries. And the second risk is political impact. The Chinese government may use economic dependence as leverage to influence your foreign policies and your domestic politics. And the final point I would like to point out is that we should always try to make good use of geopolitical momentum. We know that many people are worried about the so-called new Cold War in Europe, and it's possible, also worried about its possible ramifications for the EU's economic relations with China. But this grand strategic competition between superpowers, which is uncontrollable by lesser powers, may provide a window of opportunity to reflect on the global situation facing your country. In this way, we may find other routes for sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. And well, our time is slowly ticking. So without asking now further questions, I will turn to Mr. Urbán and ask him what he thinks, what are the policy directions, what are the measures which could be and should be implemented in Hungary, and to what extent is the Taiwan Miracle a special phenomenon in East Asia based on certain cultural, regional characteristics, whether there are things we cannot really take over. The floor is yours, Mr. Urbán.
Thank you, Edith, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I listened to our speakers with great interest, and I have to say that unfortunately, my conclusion from what they were saying is that there are fundamental reasons why the Taiwanese example would be very difficult to follow in Hungary. And let me give you 5 reasons. One is the unity of Taiwan under the threat from mainland China ever since its inception is a unique unifying power, which I think makes a country mobilized towards strategic directions easier. Now, that sense of threat is present in certain countries in Central Eastern Europe, like in the Baltic countries, in Poland, but it's certainly not in Hungary. And actually, Estonia would be a parallel example, a country which under the threat from Russia really took it as the primary objective to join the West as soon as possible, integrate its economy as fast as possible, and adopt to modern technology in order to utilize that. And so Estonia is, I think, taking a path that could be similar to the Taiwanese example from this fundamental motivation, and even the way how they are trying to achieve that. Unfortunately, in Hungary, has never been anything like that. Hungary, because of its size, a little bigger, because we are a little further away from Russia, we don't feel the immediate threat, and also because we had a different version of the communist regime, a slightly more liberal version. In Hungary, people don't feel the great schism, the great change, the fundamental change from the previous few decades. People aspire to immediate rewards and less sacrifice. Second is also related to that, and this is the values of the people. I think in the Taiwan success, indirectly, what was in the presentation, it was not specifically mentioned, but the savings ratio, the extremely high private savings ratio, which makes possible capital accumulation. In the whole Chinese cultural sphere, it is true, and in Japan as well. And so it's kind of a more East Asian phenomenon. Made possible a huge capital accumulation when we are talking about, or it was presented, that Taiwan is a FDI exporter. The Taiwanese problem is how to diversify its exports away from China to the rest of the world. That's great. In Hungarian case, the capital accumulation has not been domestic. It was primarily how do we attract the lacking capital from abroad? And the FDI's role is completely different when you are subject to inflow of FDI, when you are the exporter of FDI. So our problem, again, from the beginning was that at the end of communism, Hungary was already heavily indebted. We needed to attract foreign capital, And unfortunately, because of the need to import huge volume of capital, we were not in a position, and it's being a small market, Hungary was never in a position to actually have an influence so that the FDI exporters to Hungary, the foreign companies, would integrate their local suppliers, would create the local supply chains and made it possible that there would be an integration in the value chain. Instead, these FDI companies, which are themselves mostly German origin, but also elsewhere, are exporters on their own rights, but all they need is cheap labor from Hungary and not much else. And there is really a limited possibility for global supply chain integration. And there is also even local companies still have a big problem to become local suppliers, even when they could become. Most of those suppliers are also, who are supplying these FDI plants in Hungary, they are also owned by foreign owners. The Germans brought even their own suppliers with them. So the integration of the global value chain is difficult because Hungary's, I think the root of that is really partially the lack of savings and investable capital, and other is the STEM education. The education in science and engineering areas and computer technology and mathematics, it is not bad by global standards, but is far from being good enough to become an attractive factor. And again, I don't want to go into the educational problems on the Hungarian system. I agree that that should be critical, that should be upgraded. But the best people who are studying from the top schools in Hungary, middle schools, who would be capable of lifting up the country, they are the ones who are going abroad to study at universities, and most of them never return. So, and those who stay are not necessarily competitive because the mass education's training in the areas of science and technology and math is not as good as we have a narrow elite, but they are the ones who are leaving the country. And although studying abroad was an important contribution, I think, in the Taiwanese development as well, mostly in the US, but many of those, or maybe even most of those, returned to the country because they had domestic environment and conditions in which it made sense to return and compete. And that is the biggest difference to me between the two countries, that in Taiwan, it was not even mentioned by our speakers because it's so obvious that the environment in which you can nurture a competitive economy is competition, both domestic competition among domestic partners and also competition for exports. Now, that is the problem with the fundamental problem with the Hungarian economy and the economic policy of the Hungarian government, that it doesn't believe that. During the last 12 years, it is announced policy of the Hungarian government that they want to create a local new owner elite, but without making them competitive. We have a competitive segment of the Hungarian economy which is owned by foreign investors, and of the domestic segment, there is a part which is non-competing, but they are the ones to which the government is deliberately channeling resources to make them richer and own more resources, but they are not expected to be competitive because they are generating revenue from government orders and also because they are not exporting at all. So unlike in Korea and in Taiwan, when even the government decided to support some major domestic players, they were supported, they got support in order to become internationally competitive. And they had to prove that they are, and they became the chaebols of Korea, who became then the major international players, also in semiconductors, in electronics, in car manufacturing. They were supported initially by the government, but in order to be competitive. Now in Hungary, the rechanneling of resources that has been taking place during the last 10 years is not aimed at making them competitive, just to accumulate huge resources in them without requiring them to be competitive either domestically or internationally. And that is a disaster, and this is the major disaster, and certainly that needs to be changed before anything can be upgraded. Now, just two more factors. One is the China-Germany parallel. Yeah, you can force some kind of a parallel, but in fact, the situation was quite the opposite from the beginning. I mean, China was basically an export market for Taiwan, and a manufacturing base later to utilize its own R&D companies to spread their products all over the world. Now, in the German-Hungary relationship, it's the other way around. Hungary is a poor manufacturing base based on cheap labor for Germany, not only Hungary, but some other countries, and without any ability to really significantly upgrade from that. So that is, unfortunately, the dynamics is completely opposite. So that's not going to take us out of the middle income trap, I believe. So, so following the global supply chain development path based on our own resources or industrial policy could become one of the PR slogans of the Hungarian government if this would be a way of channeling more resources to some of these political clientele companies. But I don't think, and there is no example of any government-supported company becoming internationally competitive from Hungary as a result of the support from the government. The impact is quite the opposite. So industrial policy in Hungary has been quite counterproductive, quite incompetent, and unfortunately, the Taiwanese example in that respect, I think, is not. It's impossible to follow in Hungary. I would say the major lesson, if anything, is first we need to create a competitive environment, and we need to rely on developing internationally competitive companies and maybe provide incentives for them, but not what is happening in Hungary in the last 10 years, which is quite the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, I would say, very realistic approach to what can be done and what cannot be done. I would encourage all our panelists to switch on their videos just to be able to see everybody. And we can start a short discussion, and then at the end, I will give the floor to the ambassador of Taiwan for closing remarks. But my first question is just a little bit following on what Mr. Urbán said about national unity and the lack of national unity in Hungary. Professor Lee and Professor Wu, what was, I'm just wondering whether there was any political social consensus in Taiwan about the measures taken and how to foster growth, how to give incentives to companies back in the 80s when this big jump was really made. So when Taiwan was still a country relying on FDI, and when the government or the political elite realized that it's time to create another kind of an economy. Was there a social consensus, a political consensus, or was it really like a top-down approach decided by a certain political elite and then implemented? Mr. Lee, perhaps?
I think Professor Wu will be more qualified than me to answer the question. That's the area of his expertise. We all read his books on that topic. So Professor Wu, maybe you should take the floor, please.
Okay, I'm not sure if I am more qualified than Dr. Lee to speak first to answer this question, but I just try it. Okay, we know that back in the 1980s, especially between we know that the takeoff period spans between mid-1960s and mid-1980s. And this period are overlapping with the authoritarian regime, and that period of time is politically called the White Terror period, which means we had a very strong political oppression from the state, and the society cannot engage in, say, like free election, cannot engage in free speech and party activities unless you belong to the ruling party. Okay, so overall, the energy of the entire society, the talents, were, directing their efforts and directing their attention to education and to economic activities. Okay, that's one point. Then the second one, because Taiwan has been engaged into the US initiated development model, because the US opened the markets for Taiwan's consumption goods. And as Dr. Lee just presented minutes ago, that during that period, consumption goods is a major sector for exports. Okay, so in that period, the small and medium enterprises nurtured a lot of skills and earned a lot of money, and this money means a lot for Taiwan. You know, this money is squeezed from the cheap labor, and in Taiwan, because of the industrial structure, is so much different from the Korean model. In Korea, we have shovels, but in Taiwan, we don't have. We didn't have very many big giant companies like Samsung, like Hyundai, you know. So in Taiwan, the people can have, can enjoy quite a good social mobility based on their own efforts. You become an engineer, you become a technician, and you learn skills from the small workshop. And this workshop is related to the competitive sector and in the export sector. So you can learn skills and you can raise money, save money. And as Dr. Urbán just said, we have a very high saving rate. So we didn't really need a lot of FDI from US and Japan. What we got from US and Japan is their markets and their production skills. And the local people learn quickly, So this pattern creates a kind of tacit, I would say. There's no written political or social consensus or social contract, so to speak. But there's a hidden, or there's a tacit consensus among the people that we can enjoy social mobility for the majority of the people in that period. So I think this is quite an open secret for the very early story of Taiwan's success.
Thank you very much. There are some excellent questions coming up from our viewers. And what is about this exciting entrepreneurship ecosystem in Taiwan? You said that the private companies should do most of the R&D and the innovation. However, in Hungary, there is a brand new government agency created, which is giving government incentive to companies and initiatives and in funding. What is the Taiwanese government's approach right now? So leave it to the private system or give certain incentives from state money? Professor Lee, perhaps?
Yeah, I'll try that question. Well, state intervention is actually in the blood of Taiwanese government. They try to intervene all the time, right? Because that's how they generate, for example, consensus, support, credibility, and other rewards, right? And also, it is a part of the tendency of the Taiwanese government, as Professor Wu just mentioned, it has been passed down from the 60s all the way to until now, right? So but the way they intervene has been changing very rapidly as well. Taiwan has one of the most vibrant democratic society now. So your consensus on, for example, industrial development and funding priorities will be very difficult. I mean, the time, at least, in terms of time, it will require a lot of preparation and lengthy discussions. So this structure indicates that less state intervention is more efficient, because the government is the least efficient stakeholder in this ecosystem to make the right decision in a democratic, competitive market, right? So the government is still trying to participate or encourage to promote their industrial policy through intervention, but increasingly they find difficult to, for example, pick the winners. I mean, to nominate who will be the champion in sector for the next 20 years. It will be easy to do that 30 years ago. It is extremely difficult now to understand who will be the champion sector or industry in the next 20 years, right? So over time, their approach has been changing from picking the winner to providing incentives, non-discriminatory incentives, especially focusing on the upstream research and development level, to provide the underpinning basis for industrial development. And the direction of industrial development is increasing now in the hands of the private sector, right? Semiconductor is probably one of the most success stories in Taiwan about private and public partnership, let's put it this way. Some state intervention, but basically TSMC enjoy freedom of operation and freedom of development afterwards. But there were also failed cases in Taiwan, right? Cases where the government picked the wrong champion, and 10 years later they realized that it's so wasteful, it's so efficient that they have to give up, right? But the government normally take no responsible to pick the wrong winner, because 10 years later it's a different government, it's a different minister. No one really being accountable for that mistake, right? So increasingly, I think the key is to that is the reason I'm arguing. Even Taiwan, we are not achieving the object, but we are trying to move to that direction. Is to state intervention has to transfer into incentives and the infrastructures, soft and legal infrastructure and talent training, rather than directly involved in making decisions of the direction of industrial development. So that's probably what Taiwan has been transformed. I mean, the direction of transform, we are not there yet fully, but we are trying to move away from the traditional approach into this new approach of state facilitation, let's put it this way.
Yeah, I think this is important, state facilitation, just creating the frameworks. There is another question about producing and exporting semiconductors, which is a key of Taiwan's economic success. How did this industry get into the focus of the economy? And was that like a state government which chose it deliberately, this sector, or it was a completely private initiative, or it was pure luck?
I would say it's a mixture of all of these ingredients. I think 30 years ago, nobody really, I mean, most of these semiconductor companies were created around the late 80s, early 90s, right? So the broad direction is there. Everybody knows that electronics will be the future of Taiwan. But from those literature and research afterwards, we understand that we don't really know whether nobody is actually foreseeing that semiconductor will become so dominating and so successful 30 years later. There were success ingredients or factors that's being introduced. For example, a state intervention, but keeping an arm's length from the operation of the company is very important. State do play a very important role in the inception stage of TSMC in the other semiconductor companies, but they give a very large freedom for the company to make subsequent decisions. Morris Chang came back to Taiwan partially because of the government's involvement. Of course, it's not a pure private decision by the company. We have this Institute for Technology Research, ITRI, which is an Institute for Technology Research, Industrial Technology Research Institute, which is still very important, very key institute for upstream R&D activity. They were heavily involved in the creation of the semiconductor sectors in Taiwan. Right, so they were success. I mean, there were factors that's being contributed by the government side, but again, private sector take the lead at the later stage. So the key is, I think the key is the timing for the government to let go. Right, you know, the baby grows up, then they have to leave. They have to have their own homes. That's how I mean, how they we see this. So, but again, I have to say we have also failed, not so successful stories as well. So yeah, a bit of luck also is part of the success of TSMC. Eddie, you are muted.
Sorry. Yes. Mr. Jieh-min, would you like to comment on that? There is also a question about how is it going to look like in the next 10 years? Taiwan, the government intervention and privately founded companies, what the relationship will be, how is it going to shift to either sides? Any comments from Mr. Jieh-min?
What do you mean by either side? Shifting to either side or what? I didn't quite get
well,
it.
shifting either towards more government intervention or less government intervention.
Okay. All right. Taiwan basically is a capitalist economy, and the state intervention is quite limited, I would say. As I said in my presentation, Taiwan is the typical case for developmental state in the textbook. However, the government, in terms of budget, in terms of government spending, the government is not that huge. And the government of Taiwan is not a typical welfare state or, steering state as defined in the textbook. So I think that the current degree of state intervention will not deepen, if not for any, unexpected external shock. And I think one of the most incidents, if that would happen, would be the stability in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is facing a daily routine military threat from China, and that just within this week, more than 100 Chinese jet fighters intruding into Taiwan's air zone. So this could increase some risk or jeopardy for Taiwan's position in the geopolitical and geoeconomic map. I mean the map, I mean the global map. That the White House just published a report on the supply chain resilience, and it includes several key sectors. The first one is semiconductor, and in that part of a report by the White House, it emphasized the importance of Taiwan in Taiwan's semiconductor sector in the global semiconductor supply chain, and it also emphasizes the vulnerability of Taiwan's position because TSMC alone, this single company, produce more than 90% of the high grade, the very top grade IC chips. So if some unexpected risk happens, such as war or any natural disasters, this supply chain may be disrupted. So Taiwan is always facing this very sensitivity of geopolitics and geopolitical changes. That's which I emphasized in the beginning of my presentation. So I think the focus of our country is now back into how to further seek industrial upgrading and climbing along the global supply chains. And I think the success of Taiwan's semiconductor sector is not out of fluke because, as Dr. Lee said, we started our semiconductor industry in the 1980s, and we can't forget that. It's during the 1980s, the US begins to develop a pattern of lateral division of labor in the semiconductor industry. Before that, there's only IDM, integrated device manufacturing business model in the US. But under the fierce competition from Japan, the US companies decided to contract part of the foundry procedure to Taiwan and also to Korea. So I think Taiwan and Korea as well are very keen to face the geopolitical changes. And I think that is a very important point for us to learn from the East Asian countries.
Eddie, can I just add a quick that I have to emphasize Taiwan is more than semiconductors. 80% of Nike and Adidas shoes are manufactured by Taiwanese companies outside Taiwan. And 85% of the laptops in the world are still manufactured, assembled by Taiwanese companies, again, outside Taiwan. So there's a huge network of Taiwanese companies located somewhere else, right? So those made by Taiwan network is also part of the contribution powers into Taiwan's economic R&D growth, right? So I think what TSMC is a very unique case. I understand that our friends, colleagues from Hungary cannot imagine that there's another TSMC in the European Union, but TSMC is not what the only thing Taiwan have, right? We have other thing. I want to add one recommendation is that a coordination with your major R&D or contracting partners is very important. For example, in the case of Germany, in the case of Taiwan, we have constant coordination with the US and Japan, so such that we understand what they are thinking. We can predict the future of their industrial development, so we can plan our facilitation and contract manufacturing ecosystem accordingly. So understanding what Germany is looking for, what France is actually developing is actually a very important process of creating a sustainable partnership in the supply chain. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This was very important that you pointed out that political and economic dialogue is also vital to create a successful model, because we are part of a global economic world. And then finally, because we are unfortunately approaching the end of the time, although I think there are many, many questions which we would still would like to raise, but perhaps at another time. I will give the floor to Ambassador Shih-Chung Liu from Taiwan's representation in Hungary for closing remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. I apologize for the technical problems earlier, because I was not able to introduce two of my best friends and also leading experts from Taiwan to this conference. But you all have their bio. I don't have to spend extra time to introduce them, how good they are. They are all good friends of mine. That's why I invited them to join this discussion. Thank you, Equilibrium Institute, for co-hosting this event with us. I think it couldn't have come at a better time, because a lot of issues that we discussed earlier, including whether the so-called Taiwan economic development model can be compatible to the Hungary. Apparently, our Professor László has different kind of views, but I think that's not the issue. The key issue is that there has been growing interest among Taiwanese companies to Central and Eastern European countries. So the reason why Professor Wu and Professor Li explained the evolution of Taiwanese trade policies, starting from over-depending on the Chinese market in the late 80s and the first decade of the 21st century, to pivoting to mostly ASEAN markets. And now they are looking for new alternative market like Central and Eastern European countries, including Hungary. So, we discuss a lot about how private sector can play a very leading role in pushing for the government's support. I think that's exactly how the so-called Taiwan model is. It's a mixture. It's a joint effort by private sector and Taiwanese government. The case in the TSMC, I must say that one of the key reasons why TSMC decided to keep their most advanced and most sensitive product in Taiwan is because Taiwan provides a very, very good investment environment. TSMC keep their most advanced product in southern part of Taiwan. So it received a lot of support from not only from central government, but also local government. And now TSMC is more than just a key player in international semiconductor market, but also potential game changers. So that's the strategic asset of Taiwan. Second, as I explained earlier, a Taiwanese company, sometimes they move even faster than our government. So when Professor László explained a little bit earlier that apparently Hungarian government doesn't have that kind of mentality in terms of reinforcing competitiveness of the Hungarian companies, I think the key issue is right now there has been more Taiwanese companies expressing their interest in coming to Hungary for investment. In fact, in the past several years, there has been quietly some Taiwanese big company set foot in the soil of Hungary. Just name it, the Jieh-min, the Foxconn. We talk about giant company. I discussed with why the Jieh-min decided to open a new investment in Hungary 3 years ago. Their leader told me that simple logic, they just want to move their production site as close as to the market. More than 50% of the giant bicycle making company, their market are in Europe. They decided to open a new assembly line. Just recently, I also received a lot of questions from Taiwanese company. They are bicycle auto parts company. There are some traditional manufacturing company. They all think about coming to Hungary. I told them that compared with other 3 V4 countries, Hungary provide better incentives. So I think the reality is that there are more Taiwanese companies. They have expressed their willingness come to here. Take this bike parts company, for example. They wanted to join the clusters created by the Jieh in the Jieh in Hungary. So we do see a lot of things going on under the table. My office has been assisting them in terms of a marketing survey, or hopefully in the future some real investment from Taiwan. But all I can say is that to conclude my remark is that there are more Taiwanese companies. They are looking for alternative market. ASEAN is not the only choice for them now. More of them are wanting to pull out of their business from China because of a lot of structural issue related to China's economic and political system, as Dr. Wu pointed out earlier. They see Central Eastern European countries as a new alternative. So in that part, I would, through this kind of discussion, it would be very helpful for Taiwanese company to understand the real story about the investment opportunity in Hungary. So with that, I would again thank you so much for all the participants to contribute their very inspiring thought to this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I also would like to thank all our participants for their very valuable presentations, comments, and thoughts. It was a thought-provoking panel discussion. I think we all learned a lot about Taiwan, also about Hungary, what could be done, what couldn't be done. But I think the main takeaways are still valid. The importance of education, creating the framework for companies, the so-called hard and soft infrastructure, and to foster competitiveness in the private sector. I think these are the most important messages that we can learn from the Taiwanese example. And I think we came to the end of our time. I'm just wondering whether Tamás would like to say a few words at the end.
I just want to thank all the participants for joining and all the guests, and we hope that we can keep on talking about the Taiwan's economic miracle, because we believe it's an important example for Hungary. And thank you everyone for joining this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a very nice day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.